Okay, afternoon everyone. Really nice to see so many of you here today. I think possibly in record-breaking numbers for a call webinar, but it's great to have you all here with us. So welcome to this Wednesday webinar session. So this session is all about ambitious sensory story sharing, and we're really delighted to welcome Joanna Grace as our presenter today. Joanna, I'm sure, will be well known to lots of you. She is a former teacher, a current author, founder of the Sensory Project. She's a fantastic trainer and a sensory engagement and inclusion specialist. And if you haven't watched the talk about inclusion that she and her friend Chloe did at one of the TEDx conferences a few years ago, I strongly recommend you go and seek it out on YouTube. But this afternoon, we're thinking about sensory stories, and Jo is going to talk to us about how to know when to move on to a new sensory story, how to change over from an old one to a new one. And as ever, if you have questions, please type them into the chat box and we'll come back to them at the end of the session. And this session is being recorded, so you will receive a link to the recording, and it will be posted up on the Call YouTube channel in the next couple of days. So thanks very much for joining us, and Jo, I'm going to hand over to you. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Claire. Hello, everybody. It's wonderful that you all came to this webinar. Claire was telling me before that she's never had so many people here, so I'm a bit aware that there's lots of people looking at me and I can't see any of you, which feels very strange, but that's the modern world. I'm talking to you today about ambitious and inclusive sensory storytelling, and I'm kind of presuming that everybody knows what a sensory story is, but if you don't, come and find my website or just come and find me on Facebook or Twitter and I will merrily tell you. But sensory stories in a nutshell are concise texts, typically 8 to 10 sentences long, in which each sentence is partnered with a rich and relevant sensory stimulation. And across the course of those sentences, you would expect to offer stimulation to all of your senses. I have to do that because I run to 7 senses on the sensory projects, and once you start including subconscious senses, it's a bit like gateway drugs. It's a slippery slope into more of them. So sometimes I'm 7, sometimes I'm 8, occasionally I slip to 11, but I try and offer sensation through a sensory story to 7 sensory systems over the course of a sensory story. And I'm currently running an online training that is an iteration of my in-person training, but COVID zapped that, called Ambitious and Inclusive Sensory Storytelling. And I think a lot of people look at that and think, oh, it's about sensory storytelling. And I sort of want to go, it's about the ambitious bit and the inclusive bit. Like, there's so much more we can do with sensory stories than what we're already doing. They're already brilliant, but you can do even more with them. And I'm like their biggest fan. That's why I write books about them. That's why I write sensory stories. That's why I publish them, is because I think they're brilliant. I didn't invent them. They were around long before me, but there's so much we can do with them. And one of the things that we can do with them is tell them to the most effective until they are at their most effective. And so what I'm talking about in this webinar, believe it or not, is assessment. And I know I'm recognizing lots of names that pop up, and I hope that I'm not somebody that you would expect to be talking about assessment. I can't say that I am delighted by the thought of assessment, but assessment should be a useful thing. It shouldn't just be that you're recording what happens in a sensory storytelling session in order to prove to somebody else that it happened. The recording that you do in a sensory story session should be useful, and it should have an impact on the people to whom you're sharing sensory stories. So what I'm going to look at here is a super quick and I hope useful technique for recording how a sensory storytelling session goes. So at the moment, you might I always think of teachers because I used to be a teacher, but you might be an adult care worker, or you know, for whatever reason, you might be telling a sensory story to somebody, and at the end of that session, you're just supposed to make a little note about how that went. So at the end of the session, you write down, oh, Bob really liked the story and he lifted his hand in response to the big coloured item that I showed him. And you just, it's just a sentence, like it doesn't take long, and you only have to write one of those sentences for each of the people that you were sharing the story with, and you were only sharing the story with a small group, say 8 people, so that's only 8 sentences, and you only have to, you just note down those 8 sentences at the end of the session. And of course there's another session that you're doing, and you also have to record how that went, so you just write another 8 sentences down at the end of that. But those 2 sessions are quite close together, so you have to wait, and actually you write those 8 sentences down at the end of the day. So by the time you've got to the end of the day, you've got 8 sentences that you've got to write about the first session, 8 sentences that you've got to write about the next session, 8, so you're there for about, what does it take, half an hour, 20 minutes, 45 minutes, just quickly writing down those 8 sentences. Do you ever read them again? No, because you were there, you know what happened. Does anybody else read them? Probably not. They probably just open your folder and check that they're there and go, oh yes, they evaluated their session, jolly good. When you're planning your next sessions, you go back and read through all the little sentences that you wrote. No, it's just a waste of time. And I know it's not much time to waste, but it's very particular time. It's your time. And I know you guys, you're a certain type of person. And if I were to give you that 20 minutes back, if I could give you that 45 minutes back, I don't think you're going to spend them, flicking through TV channels. I expect you're going to use them in a way that genuinely benefits those people. So it's really wrong to waste your time. And actually, if you are going to use them flicking through TV channels, well then good on you, because you should be relaxing as well. What does it achieve? It just achieves a waste of your time. And even if I just stopped you from doing that, they would probably, the people that you're sharing sensory stories with, would probably just get a more cheerful version of you. And that alone is worth something. But I'm going to show you a recording technique that I hope you'll find useful. And it's really quick. So what you need to do, you don't need to do this now, I'm just going to show you, is you draw a little graph. So typical sort of graph. Up this side, up the tall bit, you've got response. And along here, these are the sentences of your sensory story. And so this is the first sentence, this is the second sentence, and so on. And I would just keep this by me as I'm sharing a story with somebody. And if I see a response, I'm going to gauge how big of a response. So say, the first sentence I don't see any response for, second sentence I don't see any response for, but this third sentence, the stimulus that goes with this sentence is a loud bang, and the person flinches. So I definitely see a response there. So I put a little mark up quite high there to show that they responded, and then so on. And I carry on telling the story. And really, the first time I told the story, that was the only response I got. But because I'm a good sensory storyteller, and I know that you get more out of sensory stories if you repeat them, I'm going to repeat it and repeat it and repeat it. And maybe further down the line, when I do that little graph thing, this is what I get. So I've got that same graph and I've got loads and loads of responses. And I don't need to read back through that. I can just look at that and see straight away that this was somebody who was really engaged with the story, and that first one that just had one little mark on was somebody who's not so interested in the story. It's really useful to bear in mind a sort of typical response curve that we see. And this is something, those of you who know me online, especially if you know me on Twitter, will know I'm a big research geek. So I read a lot of research around sensory engagement and inclusion and the lived experience of people with profound disabilities and all of that stuff. And so this response curve is one that we typically see in response to sensory activity. So that could be sensory stories, it could be multisensory rooms, or whatever it is. What generally happens, and at this point you'll notice the first graphs were nicely printed by my printer, but by the time I got to this one, my printer decided it wasn't a printer anymore. So this one is just drawn by me. This time you've got the level of response at the side, and you've got the number of repetitions along the bottom. And what typically happens is when we first do something with somebody, so when we first tell them a sensory story, we get a relatively low level of response. and then we tell the story again, and it's still quite a low level of response. We tell the story again and it gets a bit higher, tell it again and again and again and again, and by the time we've told the story loads and they really know what's going on and they're orientated and expecting the experiences, then there's loads of responses, and then somewhere after that it begins to drop down. And this shape of this curve is quite typical, because what you get is a gradual interest at the start, a slow build, and then a relatively quick drop off. Because what's happening is that you're sharing that sensory experience with somebody, and the first time you do it, they don't know what's going on. They're just, oh my goodness, what's that person doing? And then you share it again and they think, oh, here's Jo again. She's doing that weird thing she was doing last time she was here. And you share it again and they're looking at me and going, okay, yeah, you did, I remember you doing that thing before. And then you share the story again, and maybe on, you know, whatever the nth number of times when I'm sharing the story, they're aware that I'm about to bring out the sticky touchy thing, and they begin to move their hand for it, so they're showing more of a response. And then I tell the story again and again, and they're like, oh, I know this story. I know that there's a thing that I smell and I'm ready to smell it. I know there's a thing I touch and I'm ready to touch it. There's a thing I look at, I'm going to duck because I know she's about to wave that big blanket over my head. And you get loads and loads of responses, and then you tell the story again and they're like, oh yeah, I know this story, yeah, I know this story. And you tell the story again and like, yeah, I know this story, yeah, there's a thing that comes over my head, yeah, I've done it before, I'm bored. And so what you typically see is that slow start, gradual increase, more and more responses, and then a relatively quick drop off. And one of the questions I get asked most commonly on my sensory story training days is, how long should I tell a sensory story for? Or when should I start a new sensory story? Or is it okay to tell a sensory story for a whole term? Or is it okay that I'm still telling the sensory story that we started 6 weeks ago? And what you're looking for is that slow climb, high peak, and the drop off. Because basically, so long as you're doing that climb, so long as it's still climbing, it's still appropriate to be telling that story. In fact, it's really useful to be telling that story, because if you start again, you're just starting somebody else off at the bottom of that curve. So you want to watch that curve, and when it gets to the peak and you just sense it's beginning to drop off, that's when you quickly go and work out what the next story is that you're going to tell, because you want to have that story ready before that drop off happens. And in research terms, I've watched the guidance say, I think it's about 8 repetitions, but that number is drawn from an average of a very diverse population. For some people it will be 3 repetitions, and for some people it would be 300 repetitions. I know a school where they write each student a sensory story at the start of the year, and they tell them their own sensory story every day for the year, and they get amazing responses to those. So there isn't a right and a wrong amount of time, but there is in that curve. So what you're looking for is that curve for the person or the people that you're sharing the story with. And in terms of those little graphs that I showed you, you can make those little graphs as you're telling the story. They don't take any, they're not asking you for 2 minutes at the end of your day. You can get the information from those graphs just by looking at them. You don't need to read back through. And if you imagine, if you had lots on a page, so I've got, some of you will be watching this on phones and you'll be going, okay, she's holding up a piece of paper, I can't see it. Others of you will have lovely computers and hopefully be able to see. But if you've got a load of those little graphs on one sheet, this is the first time I tell the story. This graph has just got a couple of little responses on. So I think I saw a response on that first sentence, and I definitely saw a response on that middle sentence. That's the one where I made the loud noise and she jumped. And then the second time I tell the story, I think I got that first response again. I definitely got the jump response. And there was another one that I think I saw just at the end. I think she turned her head a bit to see that, you know, whatever it was, the light. And as you go on, you're getting more and more. And you can just look at this and you can see, unless you're looking on your phone, that around here, there's loads and loads of marks on my graph. And then there's just slightly less on this next one. There's definitely less on, this is when you start to tell a new story. But if you are seeing a continual growth, so this might be another person's same problem. If you're on your phone, you can't see. So I'll tell you, first graph, couple of little responses. Next graph, same amount of responses, but they're slightly higher up. They were bigger. You know, the first time I saw that response, I sort of thought that she looked at the stimulus, but the next time I definitely saw her concentrating and looking. So I've made that mark higher up because it was a bigger response. And this is progressing more slowly. So by the time I've got onto the, what am I on, sixth telling of the story, I've only got 2 or 3, but I'm just beginning to see some more emergent responses. And down here, I'm still seeing responses either getting bigger or beginning to emerge. So I carry on. This sensory story is not finished yet. I can keep telling this story. And if somebody comes in to my into my day room and says, why are you still telling this story that we were telling back in February? Or somebody comes into my classroom and says, you've been telling this sensory story for like 2 terms now. When are you going to write a new one? You go, this is why. It's still working. It's still doing something wonderful. If I stop, you know, for this person who after 8 tellings of the story is still developing and showing themselves and showing that capacity, if I were to stop there, I take something away from them. I take away the opportunity to be fully engaged and to show their responses to that story. So it's a very simple thing, but it's really powerful in justifying why you're keeping telling a story, and for yourself to know when to change stories and when to start a new story. And you can do different things with it. So for example, you might have a particular skill that you're looking for somebody to demonstrate. So you might want them to look directly at a thing, or to, there's a little girl I know at the moment, and her target is to use her left hand to reach forward for things. Her right hand is brilliant, but she's learning to use her left hand. So I might have a little code that I use. So on this one, I've got an E that I've made if somebody makes eye contact, and a R for reaching. And I can record quite a lot of detail about what goes on in a story just by using little codes. Giving people who support you in your sensory storytelling one of these to fill in as you're telling a sensory story can be a really good way of supporting those around you to see what you're seeing. You know, when you tell them, watch for these responses and make a little mark, then they suddenly see responses that they hadn't realized were there before. Before, they're probably focusing on you telling the story and not really being too aware of what's going on around them. Whereas you give them a little thing and say, mark down anytime you see her sort of move her face that way, or if she reaches in that direction, then it's supporting them in being more aware of the capacities of the people that you're sharing sensory stories with. And you can do other things with it. You could put maybe you could put a negative response on. So instead of just having the response bar go up, you can have it go down as well. And so here I might mark on if somebody shows a negative response to a stimulus. So these are all things they really enjoyed, they reacted to really strongly, but this one was a definite, you know, they turned away, they didn't like that. And if I'm filling in graphs like this, then I'm going to be able to, at a glance, see people's preferences for sensory stimulus emerging. So it's an interesting thing to do. It helps, it can help you realize that a really engaged high level response to a sensory story initially isn't necessarily a good thing, and a really low level response isn't necessarily a bad thing. Because if you think about it, if on your first telling of a sensory story you only get, you know, 1 response or even no responses to the stimulus, so maybe your graph would look like this. It's empty, you didn't see any responses, but just in the middle of the story you thought you saw a flicker of something, so you put a little mark there. That might seem really disheartening. You know, I told the story and nothing really happened. I think maybe I didn't write a very good story. But actually, if you think about that response curve, what that person is they're right at the start of that response curve. And you want to tell that story again to see if you get a little bit more response next time, because if you get a little bit more response, then you're on to a winner, aren't you? And if you just stop and try a new one, the likelihood is that you get another like low level of response, and then that person becomes known as somebody who can't do much, or doesn't have many opinions, or doesn't have sensory preferences, when what they needed was the repeated opportunity to understand and to express themselves. And likewise, a high level of response isn't necessarily a great thing. I did a presentation at the Times Educational Supplements Special Educational Needs Conference, which is, I think it's the biggest special needs conference we have in the UK, and I called it Not Another Bear Hunt because the bear hunt is a ready-made brilliant sensory story, and if you are working in the early years, it's yours, you own it, go ahead, go on a bear hunt. But what happens is, for children who attend special schools, they go on a bear hunt like every year for life. And so when you get the bear hunt out, which is not to say you shouldn't go on a bear hunt if you're a grown up. I am nearly 42. I still like going on bear hunts. It's just when you get the bear hunt out with the group of 14-year-olds that have been on a bear hunt every year for life, you get loads of response. It looks really great on your graph. You've got loads of, yeah, he reached, he looked, he vocalized, it was wonderful. And you have all these highlights, and it looks brilliant. But actually what you've done is all that prep work, all that gradual climb has already been done. You've hit the curve at the top. They're right there in the full engaged, and the next time you tell it, they're going to be bored straight away. You'll get more mileage out of a story that grows and that they can explore and learn stuff from than you would necessarily do from repeating the bear hunt lots and lots of times. So I hope that there was something useful in that. The graph is a super simple way of recording responses. I will take photos of the bits of paper that I've been holding up and pop them on my social media, so that if you were squinting at your phone, then you can see them. Keep that response line in mind and be really ambitious with your storytelling. I think we are going to open for questions if people want to ask me questions. Claire's going to pop up probably and read them to me. If you want to come and find me online, I very carefully sit the wall behind me.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Jo. What a simple idea, but what a brilliant idea for just being able to kind of track that response of a sensory story over the course of time. Oh, how I wish I had thought of something clever like that when I was teaching. That would have saved me a lot of time writing comments. Does anyone have any questions for Jo? Please do pop them into the chat box. I'm sure we could sit and hear you speak for ages and ages, but our time is kind of coming to an end in a few minutes, but we do have time for some questions. Just while we give people some time to put their questions, Jo, what would you say is the best place if folks are wanting to find out a bit more about best practice for sensory storytelling? Which bit of your website and all your kind of online stuff would you point them to?
So I have a to download basic guide to sharing sensory stories that you can download from my website, and my website is just thesensoryprojects.co.uk. But if you're interested in sensory stuff, come and find me on Facebook, because I post lots of things that are about the sort of sensory landscape, and there's lots of photo albums that I build as resource banks. And if you want to find me on Facebook, it's just Facebook. I'm a person, so you put in facebook.com and then write Joanna Grace, the sensory projects, all one word after it, and that should pull up my profile. But if you are finding me from the world of other Joanna Graces, I'm the one, a blue star.
To remember, the look for the blue star, and they'll get to you. Sarah's got a question here. So she's saying, what's your advice for a whole class approach where some students are still interested in the story and some aren't? Split into groups, you're saying maybe?
It's a really tricky one, because in an ideal world you would be one-on-one with somebody and developing the story at their level, but most of us work in a group situation. And one of the big things that happens there is oftentimes people have different processing times. So you're offering like a touch experience to somebody and they might need several minutes to fully appreciate that, whereas somebody sitting next to them can take it in a couple of seconds. And it's that person who's going to need the 4 minutes or so to experience it who's going to need that story told for longer. And I think what you want to do is do your best by everybody. So you look at what the value is. The value of sharing that story as a group is to say, we're all in this, you know, you're a part of this group with us. But the value for repeating that story for the person who needs it repeated is huge. So you want to do both. You want to pick the stories that person is going to have repeated and let them have a chance somewhere in that day to have their story told. And then in the group situation, yes, they're going to be a part of the group, but you're looking at that as them in a social setup rather than them accessing their, you know, literacy lesson or whatever it is. So it's tricky. Do both.
Yeah, great. Thank you. So Hannah is asking for some suggestions of stories for year 9-10, which I think in Scottish education speak is about next 3-4. Don't know if any spring to mind that you can recommend.
Well, so I try and write my sensory stories to appeal to a broad age range because I never know how old somebody's going to be. And I think if you write about an interesting topic and you write in a way that isn't patronising, then it's for anybody who is interested in that topic, isn't it? So, for example, on the sensory projects, I have a story that I always talk about because it's one of my favourites, called The Birth of a Star, which is a scientific narrative about how stars are formed in stellar nurseries. And there's no age limit on that. And a lot of my stories I write thinking of, it's like panto when you write with two audiences in mind, except for they're not full of innuendo, so it's not like panto in that regard. But I've got one, for example, about a boy who sees a puddle on the pavement, dips his toe in, and then dives into the puddle and has an adventure at sea. And when he comes back to the pavement, there's a woman waiting for him. If you were reading that with young children, you might take that female figure to be the mother. If you are reading it with older children, that could be a lover. You know, it can be shifted for age. But the best thing is just to write your own. I mean, obviously you should buy all of mine, but the best thing is to write your own and to write them about things that those people are interested in.
Great stuff, thank you. Loads of folks saying this is such a good idea, brilliant, really informative, really useful. Sheila is saying as well, you know, she's used colour-coded charts before, but she's thinking it could be things like tap pack and intensive interaction.
Yes.
Definitely could be, couldn't
Yeah,
it?
this isn't just the sensory stories. It's to avoid having to write those little sentences. Jake really enjoyed this session. Yeah. What does that do for us?
Yes, we've all been there, I think, haven't we? Someone was asking, do you have a list of the research anywhere that you were talking about earlier on? Apart
Yes.
from your Twitter twice a day.
Well, my Twitter, if you come and find me on Twitter, I'm at Jo3Grace, and I tweet excerpts from the research that I read. But I wrote this book, which is called Sensory Stories, and the bibliography of this is a pretty comprehensive list of the research. And I've just been given permission to write a second edition of this book, so there will be an updated version with the more contemporary research referenced in. But if you are geeky enough to want that stuff, just come and find me online. I will merrily send it to you.
Brilliant. And someone's asking about the resources on your website, if they cost money, or are there free things or things for purchase? I think your stories we can buy from you, can't we? But you've got lots on there that you're sharing.
Yeah. So I used to get commissioned by various organisations to write educational materials, and they're all available for free under the resources tab of my website. And during lockdown, I curated a list of free resources other organisations were giving out, which was just such a wonderful thing in a grim time, was to see all these people and all these groups being so kind. And so there's a big list of free enough. There's lots of, have a poke around, because there's little free things all over the place, and yes, obviously there's the sensory stories to buy.
COVID-19 resource page in the chat there's some brilliant stuff on there, and there's huge list of different things, and just lots of folk who are excited to share this graph and this idea with staff in their school.
There's nerdy.
Yeah. Does anyone have any other questions? Otherwise, I think we'll probably wrap it up there, and we'll actually finish on time. That's quite exciting.
If you do think of questions and we're not in the webinar anymore, I am in the internet all the time, and I will very happily answer questions if you pop me a message.